We're seeing huge gains this week for the Second Amendment community in advocacy and the legislature, with Assembly Bill 3067 getting a gut and amend, Assembly Bill 2425 going down the tube, and a huge victory with the LA County Board of Supervisors in our battle against the Catalina Island Conservancy. Let's talk about it. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel today. That is right, it has been a supreme week for the Second Amendment movement here in California. You're talking about legislation getting gutted and amended. You're talking about making huge gains in the battle on Catalina. Here to talk us through it today, the legislative director for CRPA, spending a lot of time up in Sacramento lately. You can also catch him on AM 590, The Answer. He is the host of the Firing Line radio show at 1 p.m. on Saturdays. That is Rick Travis. Rick, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. But before we get into that today, you guys, if you want to continue and directly contribute to Second Amendment litigation as well as legislative advocacy, just like what we're going to be talking about today, please like, share, and subscribe to these videos. Hit that little notification bell so that you get informed as these videos come out. It really helps with the algorithms to push these videos out to as many people as possible. We want everybody to be informed when they make their way to the ballot box this November for the general elections. So Rick, let's just jump right in here. You know, we've discussed at length 5 pillars of legislation that's being pushed. I mean, it's the anti-gunners' big push this year. Starting with Senate Bill 1160, which was the every gun owner registration that we saw gutted and amended a couple of weeks ago. We also see legislation like the firearm safety card licensing scheme that we've seen throughout history cause a lot of detriment to the world as a whole and places that have tried to implement that. One of the bills, though, that was kind of propping up a couple of these large pillars of legislation was Assembly Bill 3067, basically deputizing insurance agents, requiring them to ask whether or not people own firearms as well as where they're stored in their house. We saw some movement in this today. Looks like a gut and amend. Can you take us through how we've gotten to this today with Assembly Bill 3067?
One of the things I'm very proud of the California Rifle Pistol Association is we've been able to leverage our members, our legislative advocacy teams that are part of the chapter program throughout the state, and apply a lot of educational pressure early on. That is one of the things that is sometimes missing from the arsenal in these debates. And by going up, we had a very successful Capitol Day and being able to talk to legislators, let them hear from everyday folks that this impacts, let them hear our talking points, explain how it works. It doesn't necessarily move the author to change their mind on a bill. But what it does do is it moves the support for that bill where they realize they're not going to get it across the line. And so all of these programs that CRPA works on diligently, coordinating with the stuff that we do in the background, talking to legislators, talking to staff, educating them, has been really, really solid. And when looking at a bill package of 5 bills, hoping to be able to stop them, we haven't even moved our bills from the House of Origin to the other house. And we've got several bills that are not going to make it to the other house because the authors have either, as you said, gutted and amended completely. The insurance bill is now a scholastic bill. So for those who didn't understand, gun amendments also take bills from our space and put in other people's space. So that bill is now completely over in a completely different area away from us. And so we had made the promise that we were going to stop every one of these pillars. And it's looking good right now, what we're seeing, because we're actually going in there talking, putting a lot of pressure on. And there's a lot of things that we're doing that are behind the scenes, and it's working.
Yeah, and it's certainly good to see this one gone. So Assembly Bill 3067, gutted and amended, no longer a concern of the firearms community. And this one, Rick, I remember talking to you at length about, when insurance is involved, there's a lot more at stake, right? And what we kind of talked about was, if people felt like they were forced to lie on an insurance form, potentially you can't make a claim for insurance that might have nothing to do with firearms. So definitely good to see that one go. for the 2024 session. Another one wasn't necessarily something that we were discussing at the beginning of this legislative session, but something that has popped up recently. This is Assembly Bill 2425. This is actually a dog bill. There's a lot in it, but Rick, I know there was one section that you were particularly concerned about. Can you give us a brief breakdown of this bill and just sort of explain how a dog bill, makes its way into the Second Amendment community at all?
For years, we've had several dog bills be presented that would have removed largely sporting dogs or harmed sporting dog breeds and pulling them from the landscape. And a lot of people might be like, well, how does that apply to the Second Amendment? Well, hunting is a derivative of the Second Amendment. And if you don't have a sporting dog to help with the retrieval of the game that you have taken to put on the table, that enacts a certain set of laws that can remove your gun rights for you. There's been other, like former Senator Dianne Feinstein. There's like, well, if you don't have hunting dogs, then you don't need hunters. If you don't need hunters, you don't need ranges. So like, it's the same thing as when we attack competitive shooting sports, Kevin, and try to go after a range. This bill in particular was presented by to the author. I think was not accurately presented to the author correctly. So I will say that on behalf of Assemblyman Staley, but it was presented by a group that do social compassion for legislation. They're out of Orange County, California. They are very, very anti a lot of our community, not necessarily just the guns, but the dogs that we use in our community. And so if you look at the legislature, there's been a lot of bills that we've talked about previously, like the canine bills that say, well, law enforcement's not trained well enough with a self-protection dog, so they shouldn't have them. Well, okay, if that goes through, then the next stop is you and me and our dogs that we have at home that alert us when the bad person's outside. Well, if we don't go to canine cop school and canine law enforcement officers are incapable per the legislation of handling them, then we would likewise be that way. And that's where the slope starts. So there are several bills like that that we cover and we watch because we see they try to go after things that are innocuous. And there's another bill that, I'll probably talk on another program about that is definitely like that. It looks like what? But we're following it. This one in particular starts off with animal shelters in its original form. When it first came out, started off with puppy mills. And what it said was that if you had more than 10 dogs on a site, that you were now a commercial breeder, you'd be treated as a commercial breeder, you'd be fined. And what a lot of people don't realize is, I myself have raised Labradors for the better part of half a century now, which dates me. But in that, you can have the male and female dog. And a lot of times the first litter in the Labrador might be 5 to 7 pups. Okay, so you're fine. Second litter, though, if you chose to have one, which most people like me will have maybe 2-3 litters in a female dog's lifetime. Our dog Chloe, when she had her second litter, it's 11 pups. Oops. Well, now I'm looking at a fine. I'm looking at a whole bunch of stuff. So what does that force the breeder to have to do? Well, many breeders will take the dog to the vet, Kevin, honestly, a few days beforehand and before the delivery and count puppies. So you know how many puppies to expect coming out. So you know when you're done. Well, if I see 11 puppies, does that force me now to sit there and say, okay, do we do a cesarean and only let X number live to stay under that number so we don't get fined? Do we not? And this brought up a whole host of issues. And speaking with the staff, working with the staff, putting a lot of pressure on, the bill's dying. Like everybody started to see the light. And this is why I constantly say there are people, regardless, the Second Amendment is not a Republican-owned thing. It belongs to the people. It has no party affiliation. It's a right. And that's just why I say a lot of times if we can go into offices, we can get the message out, we can get our people on the ground going to their regional offices for those members and educating, we can make a lot of ground. And this is a great example. I mean, they said, wow, that's not the way it was presented. That's, they had good intentions at the beginning, but the old adage, there's a lot of bad things that can happen from good intentions. And so we're there to educate, to prevent that. And this is a success story that we were able to do it.
So what you're saying here is what the bill was presenting, perhaps without the author's understanding of that being a consequence, is if you have a litter of over 10 puppies, you're going to be fined. Now, what we would think going down the line, the reasonable response from the community may be to euthanize puppies just because you just so happen to have a litter that's over 10 puppies. That's not necessarily humane, nor is it the right thing to do to force that choice upon breeders or just people in the first place. So what exactly is the result that we're seeing with the legislation now?
Well, that piece of legislation will die Thursday and will not move forward. And so it'll be off the books. But more importantly, or just as important, depending on your viewpoint, we've been able to educate our own community as well as the legislature of like, look, when you remove these dogs, you create criminals because now you can't go pick up, what you've taken in the field. When you remove the dogs, you're going after something that people use. I mean, think Labrador Retrievers, not because I love them, but Labrador Retrievers are one of the top 3 breeds and have been for 20 years. They're used in a whole variety of different methods, from hunting to self-protection to going out and working as a service dog, etc. But, people that do not like certain breeds, do not like us, will try to come in the back door and remove that. And we've seen that with the canine police bills. Like, hey, having a dog for self-protection, which is what you and I would call a guard dog, which, let's be honest, none of us are keeping our ear open for broken glass or someone creeping around your house when you're sleeping at night. You rely on that dog to wake you up and tell you there's an intruder. That's what dogs do. Well, if you can remove police dogs for police, then the next stop's removing dogs from us. This has been attempted in several areas. So it's constantly looking at where they're coming after us, and government comes after. And some of the people that get caught up in this get caught up in, well, I don't want to see animals be cruelly used or things of that nature. And, a lot of it's educating perspective. There was another bill that dealt with guns with Zabur, and that was one of the things that we testified about. Was it was like, hey, animal cruelty. And it was like, well, hey, if you're out training a dog, sometimes even Caesar, in his show, has had to be stern with the dog. Well, somebody's like, oh, we didn't say, oh, coochie, 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 and the dog responded. The dog looked like it was upset. That's animal cruelty. And then all of a sudden, under Zabur's bill, you would have been charged and had a GVRO, gun violence restraining order, placed on you. Well, that's ridiculous because you're actually helping the dog. Or I think personally, when we're teaching dogs to have an aversion to rattlesnakes so they don't get bit, which I know in your family, you had a dog that got bit from a rattlesnake, Kevin. I mean, going through aversion training, you have to be stern with the dog of like, when you see this, don't put your nose up there because we don't want you to get bit. But somebody on the outside is like, oh, they were stern. That's animal cruelty. And people's threshold, it's not uniform. And so those are things that we try to stop, is by going on educate. Same thing on ranges. We just had like I said, a Capitol Day earlier in this, and it was amazing that when we sat down with people that were very apprehensive about ranges and explained to them that in competitive high school shooting alone nationwide, 250 million trigger pulls, not one ambulance. Now compare that with any other high school sport. And they were like, we've never heard that stat. Wow, that changes the whole perspective. So that's what I mean. Education is paramount in this fight.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, thank the Lord for anti-venom, because Cosmo, the 28-pound little terrier mix, lives on, even though you're right, he was bit by a rattlesnake. This is certainly overall very encouraging, though. One of the things that we continue to see and kind of talk about within the community, these people who are pushing this agenda have no intention of being beat back like they are. So it's the advocacy and the education that seems to be working, and we just continue to make ground and kill these bad bills. And speaking of advocacy, we had another really big victory, not necessarily in the Capitol this week, but having to do with the Catalina Conservancy battle that we've been in. Jacob, can you actually roll this video really quick? You guys, this is the LA County Board of Supervisors meeting that happened on Tuesday. take a look what Supervisor Hahn brought forth.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Colleagues, this motion before us would send a 5-signature letter to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife in opposition to the Catalina Islands Conservancy's permit application to eliminate the island's deer population by shooting them from helicopters. Hundreds of people have reached out to my office. This is why I'm bringing this forward. I'd like to have our support. Just asking the Fish and Wildlife to deny this permit, which if it was denied, I believed that they would then, the Conservancy would be forced to work on maybe some of these compromises that I think would be better received by the public.
Okay, so we see Supervisor Hahn bringing this forth and why she's bringing it forth. Rick, we've fought several battlefronts in this overall, I guess you could call it a war, between the Conservancy and the citizens of Catalina and California as a whole. Most recently, we saw a battlefront at the Avalon City Council meeting where they were proposed with a memorandum of understanding of the Conservancy's plan. But for this specifically, what Supervisor Hahn is speaking about in the grand scheme of things, how much weight does the denial of this permit hold? What exactly is this permit, and what does it actually say as to how far we've come as far as this campaign is concerned?
Well, we've come a long ways. This has truly been a David versus Goliath. I mean, the Wrigley family, who is very much in the ownership of both the Catalina Island Company and the Catalina Island Conservancy, and exerts a great deal of financial pressure. They have went out. They have one of the top public relations firms in California working for them. And I feel they thought that this was going to be a slam dunk. And we were able to work together and initially cobble and eventually form an incredible coalition. It's not just, that it's like 80% of the people that live on the island. It's people from LA and Orange County, which is where all the port of entries supporting it from, Dana Point, Long Beach, San Pedro, going Newport, going over to Catalina. But it's also incredibly important to understand that we have a petition now that's exceeded 125,000 people globally. And I want to emphasize that globally. This is a global story, which whoever would have imagined that saving deer on Catalina Island off the coast of California would become a global story, but it has. And it's done so because you have to ask yourself, I would think, if you were on the side of the Conservancy of, wow, I have pro Second Amendment groups, I have pro hunting groups, I have the Humane Society groups, I have the SPCA, various animal rights groups, change.org, etc., all sitting at the table on the same side, all backing each other up, literally having the Humane Society saying, we're not against hunting. In fact, hunting's a good control method. We're against what they're trying to do and how they're doing it. And working with legislators, which was what we've been doing for months, working with local politicians. This is what we do best at CRPA. We work at every level. And we've been able to help the coalition work at every level. It's been a great partnership. And the weight of what Supervisor Hahn did cannot be understated. She came out and she said, this is wrong. And no, they didn't listen to her. So then she came back and she got a letter from the Los Angeles Board of Supervisors. People got to realize LA County has more people living in it than like 14 states in the nation do. And so when a body that big says this is wrong, that adds weight. As a result of some other stuff we've been doing in the background, and we took some legislators out on the island recently, Kevin, now there's movement in the Capitol to also provide these letters. And what it's against is it's called a scientific collection permit. And there's a couple different things that are going on in this space. People can write a simple note and a note can be interpreted and watered down or built up over time. In the space of removing a piece of wildlife under not normal means, i.e., you're not hunting it, there are two routes. One's called depredation permit. You show that the animal is causing problems, harms, etc., and you apply for that permit. You go through a process, and then the permit's issued for a specific time and time period to remove that animal from the landscape. The other one is a scientific collection permit. And what that was originally designed for was sometimes going through that first process, the depredation permit, can have a longer time period to go through. So a scientific collection permit was designed for graduate students who needed to pull one or two animal specimens from the wild to study, to advance their degree and advance the science and protecting and conserving those animals. So the issue with the scientific collection permit is once those animals have been collected, have been studied, those animals will then go to either that research center or a museum, Kevin, for future study. What the Conservancy did was they applied for a scientific collection permit where they literally put on to eradicate 2,000 deer. Number one, those deer aren't being pulled for the study of science. Number two, those deer were not going to go to a research center. They were going to be left in the field to rot, which violates California law called wanton waste. You're not allowed to do that. Number three, they've come up with all sorts of, quote, air quotes, scientific arguments that aren't scientific. And probably the most important thing out there is that the Conservancy has attempted this several times over the past couple of decades. Every time the Department of Fish and Wildlife said, you haven't done the science, which is now at the forefront of this debate, and they're still refusing to do it.
Well, let's actually dive on into that for a second, because I know that in your comment to the board on Tuesday, you did make mention that the Conservancy hasn't provided the science necessary for the Department of Wildlife, Fish and Wildlife, to get this permit. We do have a few clips, though, just from some of the comments. Jacob, can you roll these clips really quick?
Our next participant is Travis Brooks. You may begin.
I opposed this item. I'm a restoration scientist with over 20 years of experience in Southern California. Aerial hunting has been widely demonstrated as the most humane and successful way of removing invasive animals from islands. Aerial hunting has been successfully used on Catalina in the past. Deer will protect biodiversity and bolster climate resilience against escalating aridity and more severe fires on the island. The restoration project is based in science and will protect this globally recognized biodiversity hotspot, which includes a high number of endemic plants and animals that can't be found anywhere else in the world.
Next speaker, please.
Of achieving our aim to make the island more resilient. This plan is nothing new. On all of the Channel Islands, along with many islands worldwide that have had to deal with invasive non-native species like deer, we explored a variety of methodologies to tackle this issue. The method of using aerial hunters has proven to be the most humane and effective approach and is backed by scientific and veterinarian experts. It's also one of the most widely used methodologies on islands all around the world.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, please.
So, I mean, it's proven, right? Rick, I mean, they say it's proven. They say they're scientists. I feel like this is something that happens in political discourse in general a lot nowadays. And I'm curious if you can kind of dispel this for me. How is it that our side can make a claim that the Conservancy has not produced the relevant science for what the Department of Fish and Wildlife needs to give this permit, and at the very same time, they can say, oh, I'm a scientist, this is proven scientifically to be the most humane way to take care of these deer? How can you have those conflicting statements for the same thing?
People consider science to always be a fact, and I think that's the first premise we have to look at. In my lifetime, I grew up going, hey, there's 9 planets. And then when my kids went to school, my son came home and said, Dad, you're wrong. There's 8 planets. And I know, I count them all out. He goes, no, Pluto's not a planet. Well, what happened? There's been a debate that's been ongoing. I mean, poor Pluto has been a planet. It's been a rock. It's been a moon. It's been a this, it's been a that. I mean, it keeps going back and forth. And Pluto is a great example of what happens is, Kevin, you're getting ready to get your PhD in astronomy or planetary sciences. And so you go on a 2-3 year research, you pull everything out, and you make your argument in your paper. Pluto's a planet. You present it somewhere, and people are like, oh, the great Kevin Small, the new astrophysicist, says it's a planet. It's a planet. Now, I want to become famous. What do? I, in grad school, then in turn, work with a couple of grad students, and we go to poke all the holes in your paper and say, Kevin was wrong. He was misguided. It's not a planet. It has these characteristics. And now it's back to not being a planet. There are many, many subject matters, from treating cancer to wildlife issues to, one of the big ones right now is, if you look at soil scientists, they will tell you that the climate change issue has to do with the amount of plowing. And they can show you stuff from space that shows you when we strip the soil to plow it during certain times of the year, there's all this carbon that gets released in the atmosphere, which is greater than cars. But there's other climatologists that will say, no, it's your cars. Well, it's probably a little bit of both, Kevin. And there's things that could be done to correct both. But you see, I'm getting at, it's like this competitive thing, and science is political. And anybody tells you it's not are full of it, because every institution, every group is going for the all precious research dollar. And so, that's why you had the great, back in the 80s, to Coke and Pepsi, which one was better for you with the saccharin versus NutraSweet. Like, people came up with cancer studies, all sorts of stuff. So that gets confusing for the consumer. Here's what we look at is, there's the North American model for conservation. That has 7 pillars in it. The 7th one is, we will not have emotion. We will go by the science, and the science has to be balanced. Yes, they had 3 people present arguments yesterday. They've had several other people present arguments, but here's a few of them. We believe in not species management, but ecosystems. And so one of the things we've been pushing this fight is, you have to look at the ecosystem. The ecosystem is based on the animals and the social quotient around it. So when the Conservancy goes and they cherry pick these islands around the Pacific and say, this is where people dumped off, quote, invasive species animals, and we removed them, and look how great and glorious it is. Yeah, all those islands had no human population on them. Catalina has had and maintained a human population for thousands of years. And so to compare an island off the coast of California with no humans versus one that's had settlements for thousands of years, that's not apples to apples. That's apples to oranges, as the cliche goes. Secondly is looking at, we have all this plant life that has survived with deer being there for the 100 years, not to mention all the other things like goats, sheep, pigs, cattle, bison, etc. have been there. So the threshold on that is much lower. We took a tour of people and proved that there's a lot of those plants that are not in enclosures, which are protected, that are thriving, not just surviving, thriving. So a lot of the science was biased. We have been saying, let's not be biased. Let's actually do the science. Let's slow down this. The deer population has been overly exaggerated. It's nowhere near the 1,700 to 2,000 number that the Conservancy has been using. And we've also pushed part of the science too. California, rightfully so, Kevin, has every right to pride itself as being a leader in conservation and rehabilitating animal species. We have done profound work as a state over the last century. And the Department of Fish and Wildlife has been at the leadership in that. It's done profound work. But right now, amongst ungulates, which are things like deer, elk, moose, etc., there is a horrific disease. It's a prion-based disease. And to put that in everyday language, that would be similar to like mad cow disease that ravaged the British cattle industry and did a lot of damage to people because it jumped species. And prion diseases are incredibly hard to eradicate, let alone treat. But you have to have a stable population. So the reason they still have cattle in Europe is because there were protected herds that they were able to use to bring back and breed and get some resistance going. Arguably, one of the most protected herds of mule deer is on the island called Catalina. And That is a part of the narrative. Is that the only reason? No, but that's part of the narrative we've been pushing. And if the population gets out of control, we have a mechanism in place called hunting. And everybody at the table has been agreed to that. What we are not agreeing to is wiping out the herd. We're not agreeing to that it's scientifically okay to shoot an animal 7 to 9 times, which is the average from those helicopters by the company put forward in White Buffalo. And that's throughout different projects they've done. It's not okay for wildlife to suffer. No hunter believes in that. No average person believes in that. And there is where this coalitions came together. We're like, none of us believe this is okay. This is why you've got Republicans and Democrats from the local, city and level in Avalon to the county level of Los Angeles to the regional levels here in Southern California, Coastal Commission, state, all going, no. And so it's us pushing back. And it goes to show that just because you have a lot of money, you can't always get your way. So this is a fight. It's a fight worth fighting because it has a lot of implications both here in California for both the conservation and hunting sides of the house, as well as nationally. And very proud of the work that everybody's been doing. And again, I'm going to say, Kevin, it has been the tremendous support of people, everyday people, getting educated, getting motivated, getting off their chair like you and I've talked about for years now. This, for anybody sitting on your chair and going, well, I don't know if that works, between what's happened in the Capitol this year and what's happening on the Catalina situation, this is proof it does work. And we need to do this more.
Well, and it's certainly a battle that is going to continue. I guess just to round this out, it seems like what you're saying is that the science that they're bringing forth is intellectually dishonest at best. It may be science that is proven somewhere else. Doesn't really apply to a place, though, that has a human population on it when you're giving us examples of all of these islands that don't have a human population on it. And yeah, there are some consequences that could be very dire. And I know that the population protection has been an argument from the hunting community from the very start of this. Needless to say, at the Board of Supervisors meeting, we did get a unanimous decision 5-0 for the Board of Supervisors to sign that letter opposing the permit to be given to the Conservancy. So that's again, the battle's not over, or the war is not over, but this battle was victorious for the Second Amendment community. We're seeing victories here. We're seeing victories up at the Capitol. Rick, it's been a glorious week. What's your final thoughts on this week and going forward with the legislative session?
I think this is a week that should prove to the community at large the reason we need to talk more, we need to educate more, and we need to be working together tighter. I highly encourage people to join chapters throughout CRPA and some of our allied groups and get in touch and become part of the legislative group. If this is something you truly care about, stopping this stuff and changing the narrative, then get involved, come join us, because we're making incredible progress.
Absolutely, and we're going to continue and follow along as we always do with the legislation. Rick, I want to thank you for taking the time to be on with us today.
My pleasure.
Absolutely. And guys, it's not just the legislation that we follow along with. We're going to continue and follow up with you on Second Amendment litigation cases, as well as what is going on throughout the community. You, again, can help directly contribute to this cause by liking, sharing, and subscribing to these videos. Hit that little notification bell so that when great weeks like this happen, it can be sure to hit your inbox. I want to thank you guys, and we'll see you on the next one.